On our own personal journey of bereavement and grieving the loss of a loved one, there inevitably comes a point where we wonder to ourselves, will this pain ever go away? And so in this lesson, that's what we're going to be looking to try to answer. When I travel around, I often meet people who within the first few minutes of speaking to me say something like, hey, 10 years ago I lost my father. And for a lot of us, this is a reality, that we can hold on to the trauma of the death of our loved one for a really long time. It's almost as though that's how we see ourselves now. We begin to identify ourselves as the person who lost a loved one. And we're going to have to at some point ask this question, and it can be a difficult question. How long do I want to carry this pain? Is this pain serving me? If we look at how modern psychology looks at grief, it generally breaks it down into 5 stages. It talks about grief having a process, which isn't necessarily linear, but there are all of these 5 different elements that we will go through. So let's have a look at that quickly. The first stage is denial. And this is when the shock of the death first hits you. And sometimes we don't want to deal with it straight away. And we keep ourselves busy. And what we're doing is we're really just demonstrating our fear at that moment, fear of dealing with the pain of this immense loss that we're feeling. Another stage is anger, where you can be angry at life and God. You can also reach a stage of bargaining where you're just pleading, please, let the situation change. You're praying to the universe that you want them to come back. Another part of grief is experiencing the depression of that loss, where you begin to realize that you're helpless and you're unable to change the scenario. And then the final stage, which is acceptance. And that's really the point at which healing starts. What's interesting when we look at these 5 stages and compare them to the spiritual wisdom, we realize that the spiritual wisdom only looks at acceptance. In fact, the spiritual wisdom says that acceptance is the first and only stage to healing and learning how to deal with the loss of our loved one. And that can often be the hardest one for us to start to tackle, because a lot of the times the reality is we say, I'm not ready. I wasn't ready to lose them. For some of us, we're still hoping, waiting for them to walk through that door again, looking at our phone and hoping that they're going to call one day and tell us that this was all a dream, that this nightmare is now over. So death can be a major adjustment for us. And sometimes we don't want to deal with it. Sometimes we just want to retreat into our own little world, shut the outside world out and go into ourselves, go into a cave. And what we do there is we stay within the pain, and that's okay. What that pain is really showing us is that we're still not prepared. We weren't prepared when our loved one went away, and we're still not ready right now. And some of you may be thinking, well, can you ever really prepare? Can you ever be ready to lose your loved ones? And this is where the spiritual wisdom teaches us that yes, you can. In fact, the whole of the wisdom of oneness, the wisdom of understanding how life and death works, is about seeing it as a package. You can't have life without death. But this isn't how we talk. This isn't how we function in the normal world. Let's look at some of our expectations of how we see death. A lot of the time, our expectation is that people are only supposed to die when they're old. Death only happens to old people, or it should only happen when we grow old. Everybody should have the right to live to a ripe old age. But this isn't the reality. And when the reality hits us and completely breaks away from our expectation of life, that's when we begin to really suffer and see how unprepared we were to face death at a time when it doesn't suit us. And it just begins to show that we are unwilling to accept an absolute truth about death. And that is that death happens at any time. And this is particularly true when we lose somebody when they're young. When we perceive the death of someone else as being untimely, especially when the death is very sudden. I wonder if you've ever noticed how eagles and hawks fly around. When I look outside of my bedroom window, it backs onto these open fields and farmlands. And very often I will see these hawks flying around, and it's very fascinating to me that they will circle around for quite a while, sometimes hovering in the air, and you never quite know when they're going to swoop down and catch their prey, and it always takes you by surprise. And this is kind of how death works. Death is like that hawk that's hanging over our head, hanging over the heads of everyone, and at any time it can strike us down. There's a beautiful verse in the Guru Granth Sahib by a Sufi master known as Sheikh Farid. And this verse is recorded where he talks about this nature of death striking at any time. He says, Farida dariyave kanne bagla baitha kel kare. On a riverbank, the crane sits and plays joyfully. While it plays, a hawk suddenly pounces on the crane. Once the hawk strikes it, then all play is forgotten. That death, which the mind had never considered, the Lord has made a reality. And in this verse, Sheikh Faridji is showing us how we live our life. He talks about us as being the crane, and a crane is a really interesting bird because in other verses of the Sri Guru Granth Sahib, it talks about how the crane pretends to be holy, sits by the bank of a riverside like a meditating yogi, but really what he's doing is he's keeping his eye on the fish and he's being really still in order for him to pounce and grab the fish. And here the crane represents that same mentality that we have, that our whole way of looking at life is trying to grab anything and everything that we can. We live our life as though we're here to gain as much as possible, but we're never aware that above our head is the hawk of death, and at any time death can strike us down. And so when we start to understand this, we begin to realize one of the fundamental truths about life and death that spiritual wisdom teaches us. And that simple truth is that death waits for no one. But this isn't something that we like to talk about. And in fact, when we look at our grieving, we realize that the words that we use tend to often favor what I call pain language. We never really talk about death as though it's a fundamental truth of life. So let's look a little bit about how we use our language, how the very words that we use may be harming us even further, maybe making the grieving process more difficult for us. And spiritual wisdom, remember, is always about that second arrow, about how do we change our mindset? How do we change the way we think and the way that we talk about life and death? Think about when we lose someone elderly in our life. What are the kind of words that we say? We say things like, oh, they lived a long life. They had a good life. And so what we're doing straight away is we are using languages that show that we're okay. We understand. We understand that they lived a good life. We understand that they lived a long life. Remember how I said that the expectation that we all have is that you're only supposed to die when you're older. And when we lose an elderly loved one, and even though it can be painful to lose a parent or a grandparent, there's a part of us that understands and has always accepted that this is how it is. This is how life works. And so what we do is we're demonstrating that we were prepared. We understood that this is what happens to us in old age. And so when we're prepared, we grieve slightly less. the pain is slightly less. Now let's look at how we speak when we lose someone who is younger. Look at the pain language. Look at the words that we say. We say, "Oh, it's such a shame. They've gone too soon. It wasn't their time." And so this pain language that we use is all around the mentality that something has gone wrong. This isn't how it was supposed to happen. But wisdom teaches us that this is not the truth. The truth is that people's death, whether we perceive it to be too early or too soon, whenever it happens, whether they're old or young, it's never against life's plan. It was always part of the plan of life that people come and go at times that we can't expect. So death is never against life's plan. It's only against our own plan. And it's really important that we begin to adopt a healthier language as part of our grieving process. The words that we need to start using is quite simply, death can and does happen at any time. And when we start to do this, we begin to move closer towards acceptance. We begin to use language that shows that we ourselves are now understanding how life and death works. And it's easy to talk about this acceptance, but real acceptance starts when we have one fundamental realization: that the death of our loved one is not a problem that you can solve. It isn't something that's going to go away. And you only really have two options. Either we can resist it and prolong the pain for as long as we want, or we can start to accept it. And this acceptance means total surrender. Surrendering to how life works. If you've ever been to an Indian funeral, you'll notice something strange that happens. When the body of the deceased is brought forward, a lot of the times people will start bowing their heads towards the loved one. And at times you might be looking at this and thinking, well, why? Why are they bowing down? And what they do is not bow down to their loved one. What's happening at that moment is that people are being presented with death. They're being faced with the power of death. And when you see this great force of death right in front of you, there's no other thing that you can do but be humbled in front of it. Be humbled in the presence of death. Because ancient cultures have always recognized that there's a sacredness to death. What they realize is no matter who you thought you were, whether you are rich or poor, whether you're successful or famous all around the world, there is a master that powers us all. Death is like a master that has the strength to overpower all of us. And when you see that, you can only bow down. You can only bow your head in front of this supreme power in absolute humility and say, this is how life works. You are bowing down to a power that has the ability to create life and to take life away as well. And so when we talk about surrender, we're beginning to start to understand that acceptance means that I understand that I don't have any control. I thought I had control over the smaller things in life, but there are just some things that are so much bigger. But we can do this, can't we? Sometimes we can say, I understand that. I understand that I can't control death. I've always known that. But I can still be bitter about it. There can still be a part of me that says, I don't like it. I didn't want it to happen. But I accept. I accept that I don't have any control. And this kind of language is something that we need to be careful of, because the sentiment behind it is, you win, I lose. I've failed in this battle against life and death. I failed to look after my loved one. I did something wrong, and I'm not able to be in control of how life and death works. And so there's a bitterness to the language that we're using. And that's not really what acceptance and surrender is all about. True surrender is that moment where you wake up and you say, I get it now. I didn't realize how life and death worked. but now I'm beginning to understand. I understand your system. I understand the way you work. My loved one is not someone who was taken away from me. The death of my loved one is simply the point at which life had to be handed back. They had to be returned home. And they were always destined to go back. It's just that I didn't realize. So when we can surrender is the point at which we can say, I realize, I know now how you work. And that is a point at which there is zero resistance. Acceptance is the point at which you can now look at the death of your loved one without pain, where you no longer say that I resist you, I'm denying you, I don't want you to be there anymore. It's like the fish who at one point realizes the scale of the ocean that he's in and says, I'm no longer going to fight you anymore. You're far too big for me. I'm just a tiny little fish in this vast ocean of life. And so this is what total surrender means. It's about letting go. And I know that that sounds really scary, but it's about trying to get into a state of relaxation with life. Totally relaxed with how life works. No longer putting your guard up, no longer thinking that life is about me fighting with it, me fighting for control. It's that fish that says, I'm going to go with the flow. I'm going to swim in whatever direction you're going to take me because I can't swim in any other way. You are always going to flow in this direction. And this isn't how we work. It's so natural when we lose a loved one for us to focus on the pain, for us to have this natural longing for them to come back. And the wisdom is teaching us that we need to learn how to change the lens that we use to see life, the perspective that we're looking at life and death with. And that is not with the lens of pain. And when we do this, it slowly begins to allow us to stop focusing on the pain. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, well, that all sounds great, but what do I do right now? And this is something that you can do right now. You don't have to wait for this to come into your life. It starts with a decision. And the decision says that I'm no longer going to be against life and death. I'm no longer going to be a victim of this death because life and death come as a package. I'm now going to flow in harmony with it. And it's never too late to start. There's no point at which you need to think, well, is now the right time? It's never too early or too late. You can start doing this at any point. There's no certain amount of time that needs to pass before you begin to make that decision in your life that you're no longer going to be a victim. And by doing this, the pain isn't magically going to disappear overnight. But it is a small step, and it's the right step, the step to take towards surrender. But surrender to what? Surrender to whom? What we're surrendering to is to the life force. Well, what is this life force? Well, whenever we want to know what this life force is, we can look within ourselves. Are you breathing right now? Or is that life force breathing for you? Think about your heartbeat. It's beating all the time, even when we're sleeping. Are you doing that? Or is there a life force that is just there with you all that time? You're not doing these things. When you cut yourself and you notice that the skin starts to heal itself, the body starts to repair itself. Are you doing that? Or is there a life force inside you that's doing that? This same life force that's within you is all around you. The same life force that's within every single person that we know, all of our loved ones, all of our friends and family, all of nature has this life force inside of it. And so even in our grieving process, there'll be times where we feel alone. And the wisdom teaches us that we're never alone. This life force is our real friend. And in fact, this is the relationship that you need to build. Build a relationship with that force that's inside you, that's within you and all around you, that has the power to create and take life away. This is the master that we bow down to, but we're unaware of it. We like to pretend that it doesn't exist. We like to think that we're in control of everything. And when we begin to spend more time with this wisdom, with the wisdom that I call the Guru, when we spend a lot of time with this enlightenment mindset, it begins to start helping us to heal. And this is what the Guru's words do. This is what Kirtan does, which is singing the Guru's words, constantly reminding yourself of this message. And when we do this, we begin to slowly start entering into peace, and we stop resisting what is inevitable in all of our lives. When I meet people who are grieving, one of the most common questions that I hear is, which prayer should I read? And my answer is always the same. Pray for the wisdom to accept and remember the force of life, to understand how it works. And this is really something that we should be doing every day, to remind ourselves that life is in control. And if it helps, you can start to use life mantras, and they can be simple words of wisdom. Words like, I accept your ways. I remember that you are in control, and I surrender to your power. And when we start doing this, what we start to do is to change our words. And changing our words is about changing our thoughts, moving away from pain language to a language of acceptance. And this is so powerful in helping us grieve. Let's look at some examples of pain language that we commonly use during the grieving process. And let's see if we can think about how we can turn those into some acceptance words. Instead of saying, they were taken away from me, how about we say, they were returned home to where they came from? Instead of, it was not their time, it was too soon, we say, it was their time, we just didn't know. Here are some more examples of pain language that we use. Can you write down your own ideas of how you can turn them into acceptance words? They've left me. I'm all alone. I can't live without them. I need them to come back. It's so unfair. Once you're done writing down your ideas, have a go at answering some of these questions. Again, you can write down your own answers or discuss them in your groups. What are some other examples of pain language that you can think of? And how can you adapt them into acceptance words? How can you practice surrendering to a higher power in your day-to-day life? Does understanding the importance of acceptance change how you view your healing process?